This is a topic very dear to my heart. I grew up in the Mackenzie Basin in Canterbury, so in my lifetime I've seen huge change both in the agricultural landscape across both those areas, also in the climate in terms of reduced snow, less swimming opportunities. So it's really important to me as a New Zealander, apart from the work that I'm presenting to you about farmers. I'm talking about work that we did in late 2018 on behalf of MPI, who of course have to help support the agricultural sector, reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emission, and ensure that the whole sector is really responsive and resilient in terms of climate change. So understanding what farmers are doing and thinking is really important. And this survey updates work that we did in back in 2009 when we first looked at the topic for MPI. So they're really twofold, the research that I'm talking about. One is looking at mitigation of greenhouse gases, and the second one is the area of just how well farmers are doing in terms of protecting and safeguarding their properties against climate change. And MPI, of course, is going to help use this information to help really resolve or address knowledge gaps and look and see how they can help to implement change across the whole sector. So what we did was a self-completion survey. People could fill it out online or hard copy. We had a sample of 707, which gives us a really robust sample across farm type, but perhaps not quite as robust as we would have hoped across region. I guess perhaps a slight gap in this research. But anyway, the key point about this is that good robust samples of dairy, sheep and hort, and I would just like to say a big thank you to all those farmers who took part. So what's changed since 2009? I just want to highlight 4 key points. The first one is greater agreement of that human activity is actually contributing to climate change to a greater extent that might be accounted for just by climatic cycles. And then the second one is that farmers are actually doing more, and more farmers are doing more, which is an encouraging result. If we think about greenhouse gas emissions specifically, farmers are not quite so focused in that area. There's not necessarily a great understanding specifically about what they can do, and so their energies are really very much more around environmental sustainability than they are around greenhouse gas specifically. There is a desire for more evidence-based information, but we've seen a decline in active information seeking since 2009. So we need to think about what it is that we can do to actually get that moving again so that we can help farmers make the changes that they need to make over time. And I think really everybody's role in this room is really a vital, you all have a major part to play in that. What I want to do is just drill down into each of these areas on the up on the board in a little bit more detail, and I'm going to look first at farmer agreement about the whole issue of climate change, an agreement that human activity is actually contributing to climate change. So if we just look at this chart, we can see that there's been a really positive move in terms of agreement that human activity is contributing to climate change, up from 54% in 2009 to 63% agreeing in 2018. If we compare that with general public acceptance of the same thing, around about 80 to 83% of New Zealanders in recent surveys agree. So farmers are lagging somewhat behind, and this is reflected in part a bit about, if we look at the age profile of farmers, it's somewhat older than the average population across the whole of New Zealand, and older farmers are less in agreement with that climate change is real than are younger farmers under the age of 40. I think we can see there also that disagreement is almost halved from 31 down to 17%. So there's a really positive move in this direction. Dairy farmers, more in agreement, have a younger age profile. Horty farmers, less in agreement, and they tended to have a slightly older age profile, which would explain some of those differences. But belief increases as the reality hits home. So If we look here, 70% whose properties are currently being impacted by the effects of climate change agree that this is happening, compared with only 52% of those whose properties are not yet affected. So this means it's really important for us to start making sure that we're getting stories about what's happening for farmers whose properties are being affected out there into the wider farming population, so everybody can see what's going on, and that maybe, you know, thinking that nothing will change is perhaps not as, you know, we need to get people out of their complacency, basically. Just looking now in terms of impact on their own farms and properties. And we asked farmers about now and currently, the first set of circles, then about the next 5 years, and then looking out 20 years to around about the year 2040. And we can see that half of the farmers we spoke to already see that climate change is having a moderate or a major, in the dark red, impact on their properties. If we look out 5 years, it doesn't really change. But once we start looking out 20 years, we can see that around about 6 in 10 farmers are seeing there's going to be a moderate or major impact. And that dark red is increasing. 22% of people are seeing there's going to be a major impact on their farms. So just thinking back to what Andrew was showing in terms of, you know, changes about where we're going to be able to grow things, rainfall, etc., we can see that farmers sort of are getting some idea of what this is potentially going to mean for them. Although we can see there with the grey bars that uncertainty also creeps up as you look out 20 years. So as much help as we can give farmers to understand what it's going to mean for them is really going to be hugely important. So what does it actually mean for their businesses? And just looking in terms of what it means to them, this chart is about, do they see climate change as presenting opportunity or threat? And I think that a key thing is really looking at the change since 2009, when 44% of farmers saw it as both. Now 51% see it as both. So opportunity and threat. Just adding up all those numbers, 61% see it as opportunity, but 66% see it as threat. So upsides and downsides. And if we look at what drives perceptions of opportunity, farmers are really talking about the potential for increased productivity through longer growing seasons. And they also see potential for new market opportunities if other countries' potential to produce agricultural crops, etc., declines through adverse climate, adverse climate settings. The threats, on the other hand, come from the perceived unpredictability of the weather, and farmers talk about more floods, more droughts, and we've seen those in Andrew's presentation, and also more pests, and that's particularly coming from the hort and arable sectors. So how well equipped do our farmers feel to really cope with the environmental sustainability impacts that they're facing with climate change? The outer ring is 2009 and the inner ring is 2018. And we can see that the sense of being well equipped is declining, 68% down to 62%. And also the uncertainty about how well equipped they are is increasing, goes from 15 to 27%. So there's really, again, work to be done in terms of helping our farmers understand how to equip themselves against climate change, whether it be through land or the type of cropping, whatever they might be doing. Could you grab me a glass of water? Thanks. What we moved on to look at then really is, having just understood how well equipped they feel, what are the issues that farmers are facing in terms of making their farms more environmentally sustainable for the future? And the big issue, thank you very much. Thanks. The big issue is the land management area, and that's everything which ranges from fertiliser use, effluent discharge, planting, etc. The number 2 big issue facing farmers is water. That's both availability and quality that they're talking about. And then the third equal set of issues are ones that are slightly different. It's their financial viability. Can they actually afford to keep on doing what they're doing? Can they afford to make changes? And how are they coping with legislation, regional council compliance requirements, industry requirements, etc. So really some sort of meaty issues that they're facing in terms of addressing and making sure they're environmentally sustainable. And I just want to look at that from the perspective of different types of farmers. So on this slide, we have the picture from a dairy farmer perspective, and they're very much about compliance. So he's saying the key issue is keeping ahead of compliance, and down at the bottom he's talking about containing effluent and riparian planting. But I just want to pick up on the pride, because dairy farmers, as most of us in this room will be aware, are very much beaten up on in the media, by lobby groups, by the general public for dirty dairying, etc. So it's really important that we recognise that dairy farmers and all our farmers take pride in what they're doing to try and be environmentally sustainable. And it's important that we tap into that when we're working with farmers. If we look at the sheep farmer, it's very much about farming to the conditions. So if they're a hillside farmer, it's about looking at managing hillside erosion, and as one said, keeping the grass on the hillside. If they're on flatter land, it might just be about managing soil. It's probably about looking at the soil biology, making sure that the soil is productive as it can be given the changing conditions. And of course, water is an issue, whether it's irrigation or whether it's building dams to be more sustainable for the long term. For horticulturalists, it's a slightly different factor. They talked a lot about biosecurity, invading exotic pests, and what will come with warmer climates. So whether it's insect, fungal, whatever it might be, they can see that really they're going to be perhaps putting on more chemical than they might be wanting to apply if they're trying to be more environmentally sustainable. Just picking up on a couple of the other verbatims on there, they're talking about, well, what are the benefits to me of compliance? What do I get out of it? Is it going to be financially viable for me to do this? Can I afford to do it? And those are issues that were raised by other types of farms as well, and particularly also by sheep farmers. So where there hasn't been such a strong economic imperative perhaps pushing them from the supplier side, there's still question marks in their own heads about what's going on and what they need to be doing. So what are they doing? I think it's really encouraging that 92% of farmers are saying that they've actually done something in the last 5 years to make their farms more environmentally sustainable. And this is an open-ended question, so we invite farmers to write in what they've done. And what we see here is that there's been a real increase since 2009, when only 3/4 of farmers had done something. There are differences across the farm types. You can see it's slightly lower amongst arable farmers. 76% of those have done something, but very high across the other types of farms. And if we look at the actions that they've actually taken, and I've just grouped these broadly, there's a lot more detail in the reports itself, but here the key kind of themes fit really well across the land, water, infrastructure and animal, but the two main actions and most widespread that we see are planting and fencing of drains, fencing of waterways, fencing to keep animals out of waterways, etc. And the incidence of doing any of those activities declines as you look down the page, but we've still got really high proportions, whether it's fertiliser management, irrigation efficiency, and over on the right-hand side for those with animals, it's about stock management, possibly lower stock numbers. So a huge number of actions that our farmers are taking across a really wide variety of fronts. And very much more, I think probably one of the key takeouts for me is that it's very much about the property the property is the prime focus, with animals possibly more of a secondary focus, except for dairy farmers. So 92% say they've done something, and so we actually have a list of prompted actions that they could have taken to see what they are actually doing and how well they're doing against a number of different areas. And what we see is that 96%, nearly everybody again, says they've done something prompted from our prompted list. And I'm not going to spend too much time looking across the bottom. That's the type of area that they've taken, whether it's fertiliser and soil, planting, animal related. But if we just pick up on the energy efficiency one, there's been a huge increase in that since 2009. So now 77% have done something in that area, whether it's in terms of increased use of contractors, the way they're doing cropping and harvesting, more efficient farm equipment, not buying equipment but using it around a community. There are all those sorts of things, increasing improvements in dairy sheds, whatever it might be, reducing electricity. So some real movement in that kind of area to add to the other areas in which they're already taking action. So that's a quick look at what farmers are doing to be environmentally sustainable, and I just want to look quickly at the area specifically of greenhouse gas emissions. And I think Dairy New Zealand talked on stuff back in 2017 saying, well, if we want farmers to take action, they need to know what their footprint is, and then they can do something about it. So we asked farmers how well they understood the types of actions they could take, also whether they'd calculated their emissions and what they're doing about it. Yes. And so if we just look here, we can see that understanding of the actions they can take is really, really mixed. A quarter of the farmers have a good understanding, but over half say they have little or no understanding of what they can do to mitigate against greenhouse gases. And given what we're talking about earlier with John, there's no silver bullets here, I guess this is not really a surprising result for us. But if we look at the kind of level of focus that farmers have put on this, it's not been particularly high as a specific focus. So they're focused environmentally, and they're focused on their farms, they're focused on being financially profitable, they're focused on making sure they're as productive as they can be, but specific greenhouse gas focus has been relatively low for them. So they actually worked out what their emissions are at the farm level. In total, 14% have done so, and 8% have used overseer, although views about how effective overseer is for the specific application were very mixed. 6% said they'd done some kind of rough estimate in the last 2 years, and another 6% have done some estimates in the past. But that leaves 4 out of our 5 farmers not really having done anything to understand. And I'm talking here about livestock farmers, dairy and sheep and beef. I'm not talking about arable ones. So this is really the key kind of market for this. It is higher amongst dairy, but not necessarily appreciably so. So if they've made some kind of calculation, can they actually tell us what their emissions are? I think this was really interesting for us as a research team, that we got a few were able to write some numbers in that might have been about the total emissions or may have been about the per animal emissions, but really, really low ability to know, to state that. So I guess if we're saying that we want farmers to understand what their footprint is to help them know if they're reducing it, then we've got some way to go to really help them to be able to do that. If we look at what they're doing to help reduce their greenhouse emission, and this question was about specifically to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, and recognising that there is overlap between that and environmental sustainability. The key areas that farmers are taking are to do with the land. So particularly amongst sheep and beef, it's about plantings, also for dairy, but very much so for our sheep and beef. It's about native forests, trees, wetlands, it's that whole kind of area. And then we get into the reduced nitrogen use, fertiliser use, organics, crop cultivation, efficiency in a declining order. If we look at animal management ones, this is the biggest area for dairy. 37% talked about reducing stock density. Optimised feeding, which has been talked about as one of the kind of ways of reducing emissions, is not so high on their list and requires quite a lot. I mean, people did talk about, I've stopped using imported feed, but whether or not that's really the kind of thing that will make a difference is debatable. And then there were a raft of other themes down the bottom through farm infrastructure and just farmers talking about, well, I'm looking at the research and trying to work out what I should do. So, if you can help me work out what that is, let me know. So that's greenhouse gas emissions, not really a focus, and perhaps we have got some help that we can give our farming community here. I just want to talk about the fact that it's not just about these things. It's also, if we want farmers to do something, they have to be financially sustainable. As the farmer on the top left says, if we don't have the income, we can only plan, but we can't implement. And the next one says, to continue farming, we have to improve, but we have to be profitable so that we've got the discretion to be able to invest. And therefore, it's no surprise that when we asked farmers what would encourage you to become more environmentally sustainable, top of the list, what would most encourage them were financial incentives. So if we want them to really change what they're doing, we have to think about how we're going to help them do it. It's not just about the financials, it's about having the labour resource. Now, I guess everybody in this room probably knows how much of an issue that is for our horticulturalists at the moment, but it's not just for the horticulturists looking out into the future. Where's the labour resource going to come from that's going to help our farmers make these adaptations and really, make themselves secure against climate change. As this person says, he's a livestock farmer, it's about labour, it's about the planting and ongoing management. And this was an issue that I found in some research that I was doing for MPI last year in the area of animal shelter, provision of animal shelter. Farmers talk there about, well, yes, you can want to do this stuff, but you haven't got somebody to help you do it. You're fairly limited about how much change you can actually make in a year or two. And of course, the big one, information. Active information seeking about this whole area of sustainability and climate change has actually declined since 2009, down less than half the farmers. And if we just think about greenhouse gases, something like 14% of farmers said they have sought information about greenhouse gases in the last year. So we haven't got large numbers of farmers necessarily actively seeking information here. And if we just think about some of the issues here, just in terms of first who they're looking to, they're going primarily to events and field days, so we need to be there. They're talking to their rural professionals and also talking to their industry sector organisations, but much less so to MPI, who are still kind of bearing the fallout from the management of M. bovis in terms of farmer perceptions. But the concerning thing, I think, is that the indicators on the quality of the information, its availability and relevance, they've gone down as well. They seem to be holding up more for the sector organisations, but if we just look at how well government and MPI are seen to be performing, it's not a hugely positive result, but does create an enormous opportunity for us to start doing things better. So what is it they actually want from government? Clear guidelines. Just a couple of verbatims here. I'd like to have an actual description of what environmental sustainability is. Have it so it's not dictated via politics. I want it to be non-partisan. I don't want to be forced into making changes that aren't scientifically proved or financially viable. And I don't want it to be based on emotive. Can we have it based on scientific data and modelling, please? And just the other point there, what they don't want from government is more stringent monitoring. It's got to be about help rather than about more punitive types of measures. So really, in closing, I just want to say, what are they wanting? It's about evidence-based information, neutral, informed science, reliable about proven practices that are seen to work on farms, usually in the farm next door, but in my region for people with the same conditions as me. It's got to be non-partisan and apolitical to get the sort of what they would see as the nutters out of there. And it definitely, they would like, as one of the previous speakers talked about, pushing back on that kind of ill-informed lobbying that farmers see happening from many groups on the side. And so what they're wanting it about really is managing severe weather events, holding the pasture and grass on, carbon issues, water use and irrigation, etc. And I guess we have to ask the question, why are they not saying they want to know more about how to do this? Is it because it's just too hard, or is it better that we wrap the messaging around environmental sustainability? But I think one of the key points here is really that what they're looking for is clear, consistent messaging delivered by organisations they trust to give them the confidence that if they're spending money, they're doing it on something that really will give them the change they seek. And I guess in closing, I just want to pick up on a point that John made. He was talking about the fact that we're a small nation and does anything we do make the difference. 68% of our farmers are saying that they're already thinking that their sector is doing enough towards New Zealand's efforts, and only 10% disagree. So really, what is the message that we want to give farmers and give our agricultural sector? Thank you very much.